Let's look at Coasian bargaining to internalize externalities. The Coase Theorem, named for Ronald Coase, who you see displayed here, says that the social optimum can be established through bargaining between polluter and pollutee, and the outcome is the same regardless of the initial allocation of property rights. The first half of the Coase Theorem, the efficiency thesis, is essentially the first welfare theorem. The first welfare theorem says that the market will reach a Pareto optimum, and bargaining is just a special kind of market, so the efficiency thesis is the first welfare theorem restated. The second half of the Coase Theorem, the invariance thesis, sounds very much like the second welfare theorem. The second welfare theorem says that you can reallocate property rights and the market will still find a Pareto optimum. But the invariance thesis says that Pareto optimum is not just any Pareto optimum, but it is the same Pareto optimum. So the invariance thesis is a substantial sharpening of the second welfare theorem, and it's for that reason that the Coase Theorem was one half of the Nobel Prize that Ronald Coase won. The other half is, of course, his theory of the firm. Now, it may be that the people bargaining, the parties bargaining over this, cannot reach an agreement, and in that case they may go to arbitration or may go to the courts. That is not part of the Coase Theorem, but it extends it in a way. It may also be that the courts cannot decide who is right or who is wrong, because there is no law to fall back on and there is no precedent to fall back on. And in that case, they may go to Parliament or the government to establish who owns what and who is in the right. Again, that's not part of the Coase Theorem, but it extends it in a way. Now, how does this work? Let's look at a simple cost-benefit diagram. We have emissions on the horizontal axis, we have cost or price on the vertical axis. If there's no regulation, then this is the amount of emissions that we would have, and if you push down emissions, it gets more and more expensive to do so. So the brown curve is the marginal costs, represents the marginal cost of emission reduction. If there's no emissions, then nobody has any reason to be bothered by these emissions, but as emissions grow, the nuisance grows as well. So the green curve represents the marginal benefits of emission reduction. The optimum is where costs and benefits curve meet at the margin, so Q star is the optimal amount of emissions. And if this were a situation where the government could impose a tax, then P star would be the P good tax, the tax that exactly internalizes the externality. But now let's suppose that there's no tax possible. And the example I'm going to use is you're living in an apartment, and a new neighbor moves in and she plays the saxophone. She's not very good at saxophone playing and she plays it quite a lot. So what can you do in this case? Well, the government will not impose a bigoud tax on your neighbor. So what can be done? And there's also, let's start with a situation where there's no rules in the apartment block that you live, and no rules about the amount of noise you can make, that is. So what can you do? You're quite annoyed, you really want to study or watch telly or do something, and you're sick to the back teeth of listening to another awful rendition of the Pink Panther. So what you can do is knock on your neighbor's door and say, please, can you stop? Can you start playing a little bit less? Can you just make a little bit less noise? And of course there's no rules about how much noise you can make, so you're essentially infringing on her right to make as much noise as possible. So you can say, well, I'm so annoyed that I'm going to give you money, I'm going to bribe you to play less. Now if we are somewhere here, then actually you're so annoyed that your willingness to compensate the polluter, your willingness to pay her to play less, is actually quite substantial. And at this point, she's also not that keen on playing anymore. She may have other plans for that night. The lips may be sore from playing. So at this point, actually, it may be she doesn't need a lot of convincing to play less. And let's assume that this amount is 15 and this amount is 5. Then a mutually advantageous deal can be struck. If you give her 10 at this point, then you actually paid less than you were willing to pay. She actually gets more than she was willing to accept. So here a mutually advantageous deal can be struck. And that is not just here, but it's here too, and it's here. But if you move to this part of the graph, then actually your willingness to pay her to play less is quite small, whereas she is still really keen on playing, so her willingness to accept compensation to play less is quite high. So here no deal can be struck, and if this is the starting point where she can make as much noise as she wants, then you would find the optimal amount of noise at Q star. That is at that point no at that point no further deal can be struck that is to the advantage of both. And the amount of money that would change hands is P star. Now let's turn the situation around and you live in a building where there is a right to silence, where people cannot make noise as much as they want, or they cannot make any noise whatsoever. Now the situation is reversed. Your neighbor feels like, I really want to play the saxophone, but I am not allowed to. So what can she do? Well, she can come to you and knock on your door and says, I really, really, really want to play the saxophone. What about I give you some money, I bribe you to allow me to do so. So the starting point is here, and she is really keen, so she is prepared to pay you 15 to play the saxophone. And you said, well, actually a little bit of saxophone playing isn't that bad. You haven't heard her play yet at that point. So I'm willing to accept 5 to allow this to happen. And that means that a mutually advantageous deal can be struck. If she gives you 10, she paid less than she would have paid, and you got more than you needed. So a mutually advantageous deal can be struck, and that is true here, it's true here, it stops here. But if you go to this particular part of the graph, that is no longer the case, because she is no longer willing to pay that much, because she would be tired, whereas at this point you are really getting annoyed with all the noise. So at this part of the graph, no mutually advantageous deal can be struck. And that means that if your starting point is here, there is a right to silence, you end up in the optimal amount of noise Q star, and the amount of money that is changing hands is P star. So you've reached the social optimum. And you reach the social optimum when the starting point is a right to silence, and you reach the social optimum when the starting point is a right to make as much noise as you want. Right? That's the Coase Theorem. Now, there's a whole bunch of assumptions that go into the strict version of the Coase Theorem. The one that Coase emphasizes is no transaction cost. This bargaining can just be done, and there's no real cost involved. And that then immediately implies that as soon as you go to the courts, or as soon as Parliament needs to pass a law, there are very substantial transaction costs, and that is why that is not part of the Coase Theorem. It also assumes that you actually know each other's willingness to accept compensation and willingness to pay. That is, all relevant information is revealed in the bargaining process. That's a key assumption. Another key assumption is that the position of the cost and benefit curves does not change when money changes hands. And when money changes hands, you essentially have an income transfer. So this means that either the transfer is small, so small that it's negligible, or the willingness to pay is independent of income, zero income illustrations. And it also assumes that there's no status quo bias, and there's zero loss aversion, that the willingness to accept compensation is the same as the willingness to pay. These are all pretty tall assumptions. And therefore the question is the Coase Theorem just theoretical curiosity, or can it be used to solve real environmental problems, real problems of externalities? First example of Coasian action is the case of Mine de Potasse d'Alsace. This is a potassium mine in the north of France. It began dumping chlorides in the Rhine in 1931 and started doing so after the locals had complained about dumping the chlorides in the local groundwater, and they decided to put it in the river instead. This caused considerable problems downriver, particularly with drinking water in the Netherlands. This lasted for decades, caused a lot of aggravation, but in 1972 an agreement was reached that the mines would no longer dump these chlorides, and an agreement was also reached on who would pay for these countermeasures. And you see the cost sharing agreement displayed here. The Netherlands paid a good amount, France paid a good amount, 30%, and then Germany and Switzerland also paid a fair share. And you may wonder why, particularly Switzerland, which sits upriver, is not bothered by these emissions at all. But Switzerland also emitted chlorides into the water that also bothered the Netherlands, and the Swiss decided that it was cheaper for them to pay for the French to clean up their act than to clean up their own Swiss act. And the same is true for Germany. So that is why these two countries were part of the agreement. They essentially paid for another polluter to pollute less rather than pollute less themselves. In 1991 this agreement was revised. Switzerland had closed one of the plants, no offending plants, so they paid in less, and essentially the Dutch were allowed to keep their own money, and that was diverted to enhanced drinking water purification. So from 1991 onwards, the agreement is essentially that France and Germany pay to reduce emissions. It's a polluter pays. This has not come from some sort of international authority imposing a tax. And this was all done well before the EU had any powers to do so. The United Nations never had any powers. It was not mandated by the courts. No, it was essentially four sovereign parties coming together and pressing out a deal that essentially solved the problem. And from 1991 onwards, it is the polluter that paid the entire bill for all this. So this is an example of Coasian bargaining. There were transaction costs involved because this involved a lot of diplomacy, ambassadors being called back, and so on and so forth. There was a real cost involved, but apparently the cost of bargaining was much less substantial than the cost of solving of the problem, or the cost of solving the problem. This is one example of Coasian action where the polluter pays. There's many other examples, but the waters are considerably muddied by the tort of nuisance. This goes back to King John. Before John was king, he was Prince John. He was the main antagonist in the Robin Hood stories. This is what he looked like when I was young. This is what he looked like when you were young. King John, of course, also signed Magna Carta, but that's not what this is about. What had happened was that Jordan the miller had decided that his mill wasn't powerful enough and extended the reservoir that powered his water-powered mill, and in doing so had flooded the lands of Simon of Merston. Simon did not like that at all, went to the king to complain, and King John rules that this was not okay. You cannot just go and not flood your neighbor's lands. And since 12,001, when King John ruled, it has been the default position in common law that the polluter pays. This muddies the waters of the Coase Theorem because the property rights have been established. And it's not really voluntary bargaining anymore, because there's always the background, there's always the possibility of taking somebody to court over this. It's not entirely voluntary since 1201. This was extended in 1931 to nuisance across borders. This is the trail smelter case, where a smelter of nickel and some other metals in Canada caused noxious fumes that did damage to the people in Washington state. And this went to an international court of arbitration, and the court rules that you cannot just harm your neighbors, but also when those neighbors are across an international border, you cannot harm them either. This explains possibly a lot of action that you see, particularly in the US. What you see happening there is that around chemical plants or around power plants, the companies buy up property, sometimes buy out entire villages, just to make sure that they don't complain, that they don't take you to court. And sometimes this happened after something went wrong, after an accident, that instead of being taken to court and being forced to pay damages, they just settle out of court. It also happens after an almost accident, after a near miss, when the company is reminded that what they're doing is dangerous, and the neighbors are reminded that what they're doing is dangerous as well. And they just buy up all the houses, buy out all the land. But it also happens in anticipation. And when you establish a new facility, the first thing you do is to make sure that nobody lives near, and therefore nobody can ever complain or take it to court. Clearly the polluter pays. Is this voluntary, or is this because of the threat of the power of the law? It's unclear, but it is Coasian in a way. There's also examples where the Pollutee pays. And one example is by Vitel, which makes bottled water, spring water essentially. It's a company nowadays owned by Nestle. And around the springs where Vitel gets its water, farmers are paid by the company to reduce the amount of fertilizers that they put on their land. Now, there's no reason for the farmer to do this because the fertilizer application that they have is well within the legal limits that are imposed on them. But those fertilizer still leaks into the groundwater and into the springs and still bother Vitel. Of course, their whole selling point is that their water is wonderfully clean. And Vitel essentially voluntarily pays farmers to use much less fertilizers than they would like. And here it's clearly the case that the Pollutee pays. Vitel is the party that is harmed by the overuse of fertilizers, and it essentially bribes the farmers to reduce fertilizer use. Another example is New York City, which is bothered by the use of fertilizers and pesticides up river in the Catskill Delaware watershed. And New York City decided that it was cheaper to buy out the farmers there and establish a nature reserve essentially. And they decided this was cheaper than building a water treatment plant. The Pollutee pays in this case for polluters not to pollute. This also works across international borders. Sweden and Finland pay for the reduction of water and air pollution in Poland and the Baltic states. Essentially, after the Berlin Wall came down, there was an opportunity there to clean up air pollution that blows over the Baltic Sea, water pollution that flows into the Baltic Sea, and essentially these countries went in and said, we're going to pay for you to clean up because we are bothered by the water pollution and the air pollution. They tried to do the same in Russia, which is actually a bigger offender, but did not succeed because of the administrative chaos in Russia first and the corruption in Russia later. Sweden and Finland were successful in doing so. Pollutee pays to clean up the pollution. Japan tried to do the same, particularly in China and the Philippines, places like that. Largely failed because Japan could not get its act together. But these are clear examples within countries, between countries, where the pollutee pays to have the pollution cleaned up. One problem with the Coase Theorem is that it's very easy to imagine bargaining between two parties, you and your saxophone-playing neighbor. But when multiple parties get involved, it actually becomes very complicated. When there's many pollutees or many polluters, it actually becomes harder. But there's examples of this as well. So in Santa Maria, that's in California, the coordination between pollutees, of which there were many, were solved by the municipality. Essentially what the government of Santa Maria did was it imposed a tax on houses near a smelly feedlot, and it was a temporary fee that they paid, and when enough monies were collected they essentially bought out the farmer and told him to go elsewhere. And that solved the coordination problem. None of the individual homeowners had enough purchasing power to buy out the farm, but together they would have enough purchasing power, but then of course it becomes essentially a public good, and in this case the government, the local government stepped in to solve this. It is not necessarily the local government that needs to do this. It can also be an NGO that solves these coordination problems. And one example is Nature Conservancy and Environmental Defense Fund, two sizable NGOs getting together and together start a fundraising campaign, and the monies that were raised were used to buy out fishers, as well as buy out fishing rights, as well as fishing equipment. And essentially they played on the on the concerns that people had about overfishing, and sort of if you fish for tuna, you hurt dolphins and all that stuff, and turtles and things like that. And essentially they played on those fears that are shared by a large amount of people, each willing to pay a little bit, and they used that to collectively gather a lot of money and essentially said to the fishermen, we're going to give you money if you don't fish, or we're going to buy your fishing rights so you can't fish. And that worked, right? And they solved the coordination problem that is there. Nature Conservancy again actually went a step further in terms of clever design. They still raised money from their donors, and they wanted to create wetlands for migratory birds only for a short period of time. These were migratory birds, and they used a reverse auction to find the cheapest implementation of this plan. So essentially, they raised a lot of money, and instead of just buying out rice farmers, and did not really need to buy out rice farmers. The only thing they needed to do was convince rice farmers not to drain their lands, to keep the water on the lands through springs so that the migratory birds could profit from that. But instead of them deciding which farms to compensate for keeping the water longer on the land, they organized a reverse auction. They let the farmers bid against one another to get the biggest bang for their buck. So not only did they solve the coordination problem by raising money from a lot of people who were a little concerned, each of them, but they also found a way to cheaply achieve their particular goal. So to conclude this bit on the Coase Theorem, the assumptions that go into the Coase Theorem to make it work in theory are actually pretty stringent, but the examples that I just showed suggest that it actually does work in practice, that we see things that are very much like Coasian bargaining in practice, which suggests that these assumptions are not nearly as stringent as they seem. What we also see is that Coasian bargaining can solve externalities that are hard to solve through other policy instruments. Some things you just can't put a tax on. You can't solve an externality between two local parties by an appeal to the national government. But we've seen in these cases you actually can solve these issues. The first example that I gave about the potassium mines, there is no supranational authority, but still these sovereign nations could solve their problems. All of it suggests that, yeah, Coasian bargaining has a role to play in solving externality problems.